Hey folks, and welcome to Hydra Hobbies. I'm Daniel, and if you're wondering, isn't this Dungeons and Dry Brushing? It is. It was. I changed the name. Changed a few other things too, but the content is largely going to be the same. Now, if you'd like an explanation as to why I've done that, head on over to Patreon. There is a link below, and I explain the whole thing. But today we're jumping into a new project. We're starting our next 5-room dungeon. Now, last time I did a dollar store challenge where I had no idea what the dungeon was going to be, what the theme was going to be. I just went into the dollar store, grabbed a bunch of stuff, and figured it out as I went to prove that you can do this stuff without spending a bunch of money. Today I'm going to try something different, a different challenge for a new dungeon. I know the theme ahead of time. You guys picked it actually. It's from a comment in one of my previous videos. And instead of going to the dollar store and picking everything out, I'm going to be using just stuff that I already have here. If you're like me, or if you've been doing this for a long time, chances are that you've collected more than just one or two things sitting around waiting for the right project. Well, today's the day. Today's the right project, one way or another. I'm going to figure out how to make this work with just things I already own. Now, if I do have to buy anything, I'm going to count that out on the screen and tally it and give myself a final total for how much I spend on this no-budget dungeon. Let's jump in. The rules for this new 5-room dungeon challenge are really simple. Rule 1. The theme for the dungeon is one you guys suggested in your comments last time. I picked from the ideas that all of you put forward. Rule 2. No budget, no spending, no exceptions. I have a huge backlog of just stuff, as you can see, so that's what I'm going to be using. And Rule 3. Anything that I have in this room I can use. Any tool, any paint, as long as it doesn't cost me anything. Alright, so I did mention that we already have a theme and an idea to go with, and that it's actually one taken from you guys. This entire adventure is going to take place inside the body of a dead god. Been dead for hundreds of years. Its will to live still keeps its biological systems functioning even as they decay. So here's your warning. It's going to be a little gooey, gory. It's gross. We're gonna do gross things. Yeah. Here's the story. Hundreds of years ago, Cyrixus, the god of technology, and a fantasy Prometheus had a bitter feud with the god of magic. Now, if you're playing in Faerun, then that god of magic is probably Mystra, so that's what I'm going to use, but feel free to slot your own settings gods in. There was a titanic battle that shook and reshaped the earth around it, and after a mighty struggle, Mystra drove a magic sword deep into the heart of Cyrixus. The god of technology collapsed upon a mountain range. Mystra, furious at the tragedy, broke a piece of the blade off in his heart so that he could never come back. But gods don't easily die. Hundreds of years later, his form is still struggling to survive, resisting the path of decay and laying, both dead and forever dying, in the mountains. Of course, a shard of magical godblade still rests in his chest, and there is a giant open wound in his side, and no one ever said adventurers were smart. Your player characters are going to journey into the body of a dead god and take a piece of that shard for themselves to forge their own magic weapon. So they head up into the mountains, they find this great wound in the side of Cyrixus, and they head into the body of a god. I don't know how I'm going to build that. We'll figure it out. This will be fine. I
I want the first room of the dungeon to be a combat encounter to get the message across to the players that this is an extremely hostile environment right out of the gate. I considered that the enemies might be something that have come in from outside, like carrion crawlers, but that sort of felt too generic. I want something that belongs in this unique environment, so I came up with the idea of having enemies inspired by antibodies. Their job is to keep the body of Cyrixus free from outside influence, bacteria, viruses, and adventurers. Now, they don't know Cyrixus is dead, so they're still working. These enemies will be focused on grappling and tossing characters around, and to make it more interesting, I want to have pits of acid in this first room. Let's say stomach acid, for them to grapple the characters and stuff them into the pits and hold them. So give them some high grapple ability, something they can toss enemies around with for fun, and immunity to acid damage. So in the interest of having room to toss characters around, I made the first room fairly large. I cut the base shape out of dollar store foam board and gave it a little bottleneck for the players to come in from to add to the challenge. I also want to add some visual flair and give something to show that they've pierced the outer hide of this massive god, so I looked to my collection of old Halloween props, did some disassembling, and came up with a cool, bony entranceway. Not anatomically correct maybe, but it's fun and grim and gets the idea across. And I just add those bones to the foam with hot glue.
Okay, so I've got sort of an entrance structure glued into place now. And it's time to trace on where the acid pools are going to be so that the antibody enemies can push the player characters into them. Now, if you're thinking, wouldn't it have been smarter to trace on and cut out the acid pools before gluing these into place? Then you're very smart, and I commend you. But I'm kind of winging it. That's the point, is winging it. And sometimes when you're winging it, you get winging it results. So I'm going to do that now. But before I do, can I just get an F in the comments for poor Fido? He's been through so much. He's appeared in so many videos over the years where I had to go into that bits box, and he's always the first thing I pull out. And now the poor guy is absolutely devastated. He's on his last legs, literally. They're right here, just legs. That's all that's left of him. And a tail. He can still wag it. He can still wag his tail. So, he's still a happy little guy. He'll be fine.
I don't know who lets him make jokes, honestly. But the acid pools get traced on and cut out with a hobby knife. Now, I don't have to worry about being too careful or about rounding them off and making them look nice, because it's all going to get covered up later on anyway. So I just have to get the basic shapes in there and cut out. To prepare the pools for filling up with a liquid effect later, I need a backing on them now. So I grabbed some thin cardstock from my recycling bin and just cut and pasted onto the backs of the pools with tacky glue. It's easy to work with and it's free, so it doesn't get much better than that. If you're not familiar with this, it's basically the material you would find cereal boxes or frozen food boxes made from. So chances are you have it lying around too. Now it's time to get some texture onto this board. It needs to be something that looks gross, like the inside of a body. It needs to be something that's sturdy enough to stand up to play, and it needs to be free. So I'm going to use the world's most abundant free resource, something we have more of than anything else in history. Now some of you might be thinking dirt or water, but no, it's leftover Amazon boxes. It doesn't have to be from Amazon, of course, any corrugated cardboard box will do. I'm basically just going to be making cardboard pulp. So you want to cut the box up into little pieces and soak it in water. After it's been left to soak for a while, it goes into a blender. Now don't use your kitchen blender for this because cardboard is gross. You can pick up a hobby blender at a thrift shop. I got this one for $5 Canadian and it's great for making basing materials and that sort of thing. this is where things get truly messy. Messy enough, in fact, that even I put on gloves for it. It's a simple enough process, though. You take a bit of the cardboard pulp, wring it out, and mix it with PVA glue. Then it just sort of gets smeared across the board like the world's grossest party spread. Getting the inside of the acid pools isn't necessary, but make sure to cover the edges so that the pools have a sort of gradual organic slope down into them to make them seem more natural. Now this is going to take a while to dry as well, so once you get this smeared into place and looking all gross and awful, you're pretty much done with it for the day. Set it aside to dry. Once it's dry, this is how the texture ended up, which is perfect for the look I'm going for. All of that PVA glue did a number on the foam board though, bending it way out of shape. Now I knew that was coming and I was able to fix some of this by brushing PVA over the back of the board and leaving it to dry, but it didn't take the bend out completely. It did get it down to what I consider an acceptable level, but in the next few rooms, I'll be looking at better ways to alleviate that. To prepare it for painting, I gave the board a quick spray of black paint from a rattle can, but that was mostly just to cover up those plastic bone pieces. I'm coming in with a Mod Podge and black paint mix next to cover over everything else. Getting that sealant on there is pretty important in this case, because I don't want to risk reactivating all of that PVA glue while I'm painting or washing. And once that's fully dry, it's time for the fun part. When it comes to painting this, I sort of just had fun with it. I picked out any color that looked gross and fleshy to start, ended up with pinks and dark berry colors, and some yellows to simulate like visceral fat and intestine. I know, I said it was going to be gross though, didn't I? You didn't believe me, but here we are. Then I take a large brush and I just stipple and wet blend over and over and over until I'm happy with it. There was no technique here, there's no color guide, just a lot of stippling and blending different paints until you get something that makes you go, ugh, disgusting. Now you should paint the bottom of the acid pools while you're at it because the liquid effect I'm going to add later, it's going to be a little translucent. But really, yeah, you're just stippling and dotting until it looks disgusting. The plastic bone pieces do get painted as well, of course, but I just do a few layers of progressively lighter dry brushing on these. I start with a mid-gray and work up, and that's it really. They're bone. They're not worth spending too much time on, and no matter what you do with them, they're not going to be stealing the show from the gross texture and the acid pools. So my advice is to do just enough to get the point across. That may be something you don't hear from most hobby YouTubers, but let's be real. They're plastic bones. Even if you go way over the top, they're gonna look like plastic bones. So instead, put your limited hobby time where it's most impactful and just keep these simple. Finally, to add a little extra dimension to the floor, I did a crimson oil wash. Now you could absolutely do this with acrylics instead, but I want to handle the usual question up front this time. Oil washes are not as difficult or high level as people think. They're extremely easy to do. They're far cheaper than bottled acrylic wash, and cost over time is about on par with homemade acrylic washes. On top of that, they work far, far better than those products. That said, for something with this extreme texture, you would absolutely get a good result from an acrylic wash, so feel free to go that route if that's what you're comfortable with. For the liquid effects, I'm going to be using 2-part epoxy glue. Now I get this at the dollar store and it's so cheap and so useful that I keep it in stock in my craft space. This stuff looks great for liquids and can be tinted by mixing in just a little bit of any paint. That said, once the chemical reaction begins by mixing the 2 parts together, you have a very, very short time to work with it. You want all of your materials, something to mix it in, something to stir with, and your paint ready to go before you even start. Move quickly once it begins. You can sort of use a craft stick to push the glue into the places you want it, and it will self-level from there. Be warned that this chemical reaction creates an intense amount of heat, so you don't want to touch anything around it or even leave it on your cutting mat since it could damage it. but once it's dried, it makes for an incredible and incredibly cheap liquid effect.
Okay, so before we do the big reveal, I just want to talk about the antibody enemies that are going to be guarding this room. These guys. Now, there's going to be a video going up on Patreon in a couple of days showing how I made these custom enemies, but if you're not on the Patreon and you don't want to do that, I would recommend substituting them with just any ooze or jelly model that you have for D&D laying around, like an ochre jelly or black pudding, something like that. Anything along those lines is perfect for this, will work just fine. That said, the finished stat blocks for these enemies, as well as the tutorial about how to make them, will both be going up on Patreon, the latter of which in the final PDF module that I'll be releasing when the 5-room dungeon is finished. Okay, let's move on to the big reveal.
Here is the final amazing, disgusting result for the first room. I absolutely love how this came out. The texture of the floor, the gross paint, the liquid pools of stomach acid. It's all horrible and gross and evocative. It's easy to imagine the sound, the smell, the squish of the floor under the characters' heels as they fight. It is horrible, and I love it. That said, there are already things I plan to do differently on the next one, things that I learned from this one. So if you've made it this far and you enjoyed the video, please go ahead and consider hitting like or subscribe, or even hitting up the Patreon for a few dollars if you want to see how I made the antibodies, or if you want the PDF of the finished adventure when it's complete. Thank you so much for watching my first video as Hydra Hobbies. Your support means a lot to me. And I'll see you on the next one.